are so excited that you all are here. Not only that some of you have taken a tour or seen a presentation today, but really that you're just on our campus doing an amazing program where you're learning and challenging yourself for something new, which is exactly what we stand for on this college campus. And as I've been sitting here watching you all eat and engage with each other, there are several things that I noticed in the room. And there are a few traits I noticed that exactly mirror what I see in the college student we have at UMKC. So very first one, I was looking around and I thought, wow, these students are motivated. They're motivated because they've chosen to engage in an amazing program. You're active in your schools, and again, you've got that grit to learn and grow. That is what it takes definitely to be successful, not only in college, but certainly as you move throughout that life. I looked around, I also thought about how much talent is in this room. And I see that many of you are involved in this tonight because you started with your Debate KC affiliation. Or some of you aren't involved in that, but you're here because there's something valuable that you're finding in this process. And so that talent and just being eager and curious, never lose that. Because again, that's one of those things that's going to take you through. And then I looked around and as I was watching students talk to each other and laugh, and you all were just talking to your coaches, I thought there is a lot of hope. And hope is a strong motivator. When you feel like you've got something on the other end to drive for, to go for, to strive for, that takes you through a whole lot of different situations. And that's what, again, I see in our college students every day, is the hope that they carry for the future that they are working towards. And so I not only see it in the students as I look around and watch you engage with each other, but I see it in the organizers of this program. I saw it in the panelists as I was watching them get ready before they headed up to stage. I see it in the coaches who are sitting at your tables. And so that hope, hang on to that too. Because I'll tell you, really, when I talk about being director of admissions, that's not really the best part of my job. Like, that title really is not the description. I would rather call myself a dream maker, right? That's what my office does. We work with students starting at your ages, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, all the way up through that senior year, and we work with you on what are your dreams and how do we help you achieve those. And so I want to be bold and brazen and tell you right now, you look like a college student to me, and you look like a student that belongs at UMKC. And I want you to keep in touch, and let's make sure that UMKC is a part of your future or a part of your thoughts around what your future looks like, and we're here to support you in that journey. And it starts tonight, but I want to impress upon you, don't let it end tonight. So with that, have a wonderful evening. We hope to engage with you again, and have fun.
Tammy, thank you very much. My name is Alan Katz, and I work with American Public Square. And for those of you who are here, from virtually all of you, there are a couple things you need to know. First of all, you don't really know what American Public Square is, so I'll tell you that we are essentially a community-based program, an organization that has community-based programs around controversial issues with people that don't agree with each other, but we do it in a fact-based and a civil way. And this is the first time in as we start our fourth season that we have ever done a program just for students. And when the idea was first brought to me by Kim Jacobs, our executive director, I said it'll never work. No one will ever show up. And now I look around this room, and as usual, I was wrong and she was right. So I want to thank our sponsor for tonight, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, and also Debate Kansas City, for their help in putting this event together. The second event, which will be on the 24th of April, back here, we hope to see you all back here after you have had a successful season of debate. And on the topic that's going to be discussed tonight, hopefully you all will be the experts and we will be able to learn from you. You each received a playbill, that's what this is, and it has information about tonight's program and about American Public Square. And for those of you, well, I guess all of you probably text because you're all young. But if you want to, if you just text to civility, text civility to 24587, you will be receiving from us information throughout the year. Also, look on pages 6 and 7. That's this one in your playbill. It's the lessons learned diagram. We hope you're going to take some information back from tonight and share it with your classmates and others. The lessons learned diagram has some suggestions on how you might do that. And thank you for filling out the yellow survey. Anyone else still have a yellow survey they haven't filled out or they have to be picked up? If so, raise your hand. And if not, there's one in the back there I can see. So this is what we want you to fill out after the evening is over. At the end of tonight, we'd like you to get your views now that you've been through a program. So we're going to begin the panel portion of tonight's program. Our moderator is Nick Haines of KCPT, and he's going to introduce the panelists, and then he's going to begin by asking each of them a question. This is then going to turn into a conversation between the moderator, the panelists, and the audience, and as they respond to questions from Nick, the comments made by other panelists, and the questions asked by you and by the Roving Reporter. You have a question and fact sheet on your table. It looks like this. If you have a question, write it down, hold your hand up, and someone will pick it up, and it will be given to our Roving Reporter. Our Roving Reporter is none other than Stephen STEIGMAN. Steve, you want to raise your, that's Stephen. And he is from KCUR, 89.3, and he's going to be asking the questions submitted by you or coming to you for you to ask your own question. Marty Mahaffey, where are you, Marty? Marty Mahaffey is a UMKC librarian, and she will be our fact checker for tonight. She's going to be responsible for researching the fact checks submitted and, when possible, reporting back. On the back of your question, it says fact check. If you hear something from one of the panelists or a question that you think is not factually correct, write it down. We'll bring it over to Marty. She will check it out. Now, another feature that we have in terms of keeping everything civil is we have civility bells. Are there people out here who have civility bells that can ring them? Anybody? Okay, when you hear that, that means someone has been uncivil and everyone needs to stop talking, okay? And another thing we want to ask you to do is this. If you hear something that you agree with very much, instead of clapping, we just want you to nod your head like this. And if you disagree with it, just put your head like this, because we find that things work much better when we're not interrupted by people clapping. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, the world-renowned Nick Haines.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everyone. I am Nick Haines of KCPT Public Television. Going to be your moderator for the site tonight, and you have so many other options, of course, you could have been to tonight. You could have been off to Arrowhead Stadium to go and see U2 with more than 40,000 other people, but no, you chose to be here with us, so thank you for that. You could be going to the brand new screening of Stephen King's It, but no, you chose to be with us and with this clown instead. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us for that. You are doing a debate topic about education. And let me just tell you, before we get into the education topic, it can get very dry, it can get very complicated. There's so much terminology that goes over the heads of people, and particularly when you are debating, people need to understand and have comprehension of what you're saying. So in addition to the civility bells and the fact-checking, I've got the... So anytime one of our panelists, ladies and gentlemen, anytime one of our panelists says something in education speak that I really don't understand, I am going to personally be ringing my taboo buzzer here. So I will be looking for that as well, ladies and gentlemen. Your debate topic then, national debate, be it resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and or regulation of elementary and or secondary education in the United States is an entire mouthful. Well, we have on our panel this evening, our think tank of experts, are people going to help engage you in a conversation about the real practicalities of education. They're people who are in the field from different walks of life and different facets of education to put flesh on the bones and help aid you with your research as you go along this year in putting your debate topic together. On our well, which is going to be your far left there, is Matt Katz. He flew in all the way from Chicago to be with us. You were that important to him. 12 years ago, he was an 8th grade English teacher in St. Louis Public Schools. Today, he's the principal of a charter school in Chicago, serving mostly low-income Hispanic families. Next to Matt is Sändra Walker, who has been teaching for more than 30 years in the Lawrence Public School District. She also serves, by the way, on the National Board of Directors of the NEA, the country's largest teachers union. Now, next to me here is Lorén Trull, a senior education policy advisor for UnidosUS, the new name for the nation's largest Latino advocacy organization, which up until this year was known as La Raza. She spends a lot of time on Capitol Hill trying to get members of Congress to understand how policies made in Washington impact Latino parents and children. She formerly worked in the White House Office of Management and Budget during the Obama administration. She flew in from our nation's capital to be with us this hour. Thank you so much for being with us. And also with us, rounding out the cozy confines of our panel, is Michael McShane. He's a former high school teacher who is now an adjunct fellow in education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and director of education policy at the Show Me Institute. He is the editor of the book New and Better Schools, which, according to Amazon, just before I left, only had one copy left in stock, so order soon.
They only printed like 2.
Okay, all right, that's fine. And he also authored the work Education and Opportunity. Now, one of the things when you debate, as in any other aspect of life, you have to show passion for your topic. People are not interested unless it's not just facts that you're reciting over and over again and statistics. People want to know you're passionate about it. And I want to ask our own panel, particularly, I'm going to start with Sändra, about why on earth did you get into education in the first place, and what has been the biggest change you've seen in those more than 30 years?
I got involved in education because I wanted to make a difference in my life and in all the lives of the young people that I touch. I've always worked with kids, and I think that that's the hope that I have and that I see, is that if I can share part of me with them, then they'll take that and go. And it's paying back. And so I'm passionate about that. The changes that I've seen, less time with kids, more things on the kids' plate, on the parents' plate, on the teacher's plate. Less time is the biggest thing.
Well, Michael, you were a high school teacher. You abandoned that. Now you're in the research world, which is a little further away from touching the students. Why did you get into teaching? Why are you not doing that today? And what has been the biggest change you've noticed?
Yeah, so I got into teaching just because I had a series of really great teachers when I was growing up and in school that made a big impact in my life, and I wanted to try and kind of pay that forward. And I got interested in research because I was a high school teacher at a little school called St. Jude Educational Institute on the west side of Montgomery, Alabama, for a few years there. It was a really interesting school. It had played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. It was from the march from Selma to Montgomery. It was actually the place of the last campsite that was there, hosted the Concert for Freedom and others. So I was really engaged in sort of civil rights issues and others in Montgomery. And I kind of transitioned out of teaching into the kind of policy and research world because, you know, I thought that there were some serious structural issues in policy and in politics and others that were prohibiting my kids from being able to be successful. And I had to make a really hard decision of, do I want to continue teaching and working directly with students with the 80 or 110 that I had every year, or should I try and make a move into the policy world and do it? And some days I think back and think I'd probably be much happier and making the world a better place if I was still a teacher, and some days I don't feel that way, but that was at least why I did what I did.
When you cast your mind back to those days as a high school teacher, what do you see today as the differences, that the biggest difference from then?
So when I was teaching, like, Facebook was that was the first time in which high school students were allowed to get Facebook. So it started, Mark Zuckerberg and I are the same age. So like I grew up like in college with Facebook, and it used to just be a college thing. And I was about the time that it extended down to high school, and I saw like the difference of social interaction with students and others when there was this whole other thing happening, sort of that we weren't watching, of people communicating via social media. So like kids could be getting along in class, but then there would be this like firestorm happening that none of us knew about, and a student would come in and be like super upset. I'm like, wait, how did that happen? Oh, I just read this thing that someone wrote about me. So I think social media, and it's only getting more and more as the media, Instagram and Snapchat, and I'm aging myself because there's probably something cooler than that, but that's about my cool limit. You know, as those things go, it's just more and more media, which can have positive things of connecting students, but also can have this kind of dark underbelly to it.
Matt Katz, you actually started as a Teach for America teacher.
Yes.
What has been the difference for you? What has been the biggest change
From
from when you started to where you are now?
That's a great question. I served a 100% African American population as a teacher in Teach for America, and now I serve 100% Latino population. And so to even, like, there are aspects in which it's apples to oranges, and there are aspects in which serving students from majority low-income families are facing a lot of the same challenges they were. There's been a lot of reform work. There have been a lot of really great ideas, and yet 12 years later, the students who look very different than the students I taught in St. Louis still face a lot of the same uphill battles and opportunity gaps that they were facing 12 years ago. And yeah, I have a lot of angry phone calls about things that happened on Facebook. And I'll ask, like, oh, why does your 11-year-old have a smartphone and a Facebook account? But there's also a lot that hasn't changed. And so that is my unanswer to your question.
We're going to can we move your microphone over to the other side? If you're going to be looking at me, that would be wonderful, Matt. That's very nice of you to do that, if we can do that. So when we think about our topic, I mean, we're talking here about the federal government's role, but what is it that the U.S. Department of Education actually does, Michael McShane, that actually in any way touches our lives?
So the federal government has the two biggest buckets when we're talking about K-12 education are Title I dollars. So Title I is a program that comes from Lyndon Johnson's Great Society War on Poverty in the 1960s, which is predominantly designed to provide supplementary funding for low-income students. The next probably, or they sort of, I think, compete with one another as the two biggest line items. Lorén, you would probably know this better than I do of which one's higher, is supplementary funding for students with special needs. So there was IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that's a big chunk of money that they do. And then the last bit of it is a sort of hodgepodge of a lot of different programs. There's Title II, which has a lot to do with teacher professional development. I'm going to forget some of the other. Title IV, I think, has to do with technology and others. So then there's a lot of these other, some are dealing with specific populations of students, some are dealing with specific topics, but that's kind of the big bucket. If we're thinking about the big picture of education and education funding, a rough rule of thumb when we think about it is that the federal government pays about 10% of funding. It'll vary from district to district, but it's about 10%. The state picks up another roughly 45%. Again, it varies. And then local districts pay about the other 45% of it. And so policy happens that way too. So there's federal policy that's set. There was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Its most recent iteration was ESSA. Before that was No Child Left Behind. You've probably heard of that one. And then policy is made at the state level as well, and also made at the local level.
What do I believe the role in? So I think from the funding perspective, you summed it up perfectly. Some of the other titles, just for informational purposes, Title III is English Language Acquisition Grants. Title IV is actually the new ESSA block grant that covers a variety of extracurricular activities, but also then includes technology and arts and education, physical education, et cetera. So I think the funding piece is a big piece of it, and that's what we talk about most often. From my perspective, the federal role in education is really protecting the civil rights of students, and that's what grounded what you were talking about in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson's original idea to do ESEA and make sure that low-income students at the time had supplemental funds. And I think as we see the demographics of our students change and also the changing role in education and what it means to someone's life outcomes, that role of protecting civil rights really becomes the most critical and the primary role of the federal education department.
But we haven't had a U.S. Department of Education for that long. Can anybody in the audience, by the way, put up their hand? When was the United States Department of Education created? Can anybody tell me that? Not you, sir. Can anybody tell me in the audience, when was the U.S. Department of Education created?
Google.
Anybody put their hand up and say? Go on. Okay, yes, sir.
I'm gonna guess 1975.
Okay, you're very close.
That's great.
Okay.
You're super close.
Yes. Yes, 1979.
Well done.
Okay, I'm going to give you something here.
great.
1979, you, sir, are going to get PT water bottle here.
See, that audience participation pays off. This is a lesson. This is a lesson.
There's flat screen TVs in here, ladies. 1979. So it hasn't been around that long. And yet, you know, because there's concern at this point about what's going to happen to this United States Department of Education. In fact, there are concerns that in fact, there was a Kentucky congressman who earlier this year introduced a bill to eliminate the Department of Education completely. Why do we even need a U.S. Department of Education? You heard Michael McShane say it's roughly only about 10% of the money. Most of the money that goes to schools, 90% is coming from state and local dollars. You've heard about some of the programs that are coming from it, but let's hear from our actual teachers here. We hear about a person by the name, and I'm sure you've heard the name Betsy DeVos, yes? Anybody in the room heard of that name? Yes, of course. She's the U.S. Education Secretary who will be in Kansas City on Thursday, going to Johnson County Community College. But perhaps because of the fabulous speech we had from our UMKC person, she may switch and come here. Then on Friday, she's going to a private school on Main Street here in Kansas City, Missouri, as part of a fact-finding trip around the country. But we hear so much about changes that might be happening, reforms happening at the United States Department of Education. Sometimes people get horrified about all of this, but in a practical level, as a school teacher in a school district in Lawrence, Kansas, Sändra, what difference does what's happening at the federal government level at the U.S. Department of Education, what difference does that make practically to what happens in your classroom?
Well, I think Lorén stated the civil rights of students. And as I look at my students, the civil rights are going to be violated with the lack of funding.
How?
No more services. I have a group of kids right now who are crying and worried about the DACA going on that is being defunded. And some of their parents are part of that, some of their cousins and their relatives are part of that. And so as kids come to me, I'm still trying to teach traumatized kids. And it's very difficult to teach anyone who has experienced trauma and to try to get them to understand that life still goes on, but it's still very difficult when they're crying or they can't get their work done or they don't want to do their work. And you know what? It's not important. That schoolwork, that test, it's not important. And to get them to understand that and to get the state to understand that with the funding. And so with the changes that are coming, like, okay, let's defund, let's do vouchers. So you pull money that's already non-existent from the kids that we already are not serving well, then what? But we still have to take care of them. They still are expected to learn. So it's a vicious circle. And it's very difficult. Haven't eaten breakfast. Well, today's Tuesday. I have a kid, first meal they had since Saturday was today at school breakfast.
And that's part of a federal program?
No, their parents don't have any money. That's not federal, no. But as far as we have to feed them, and yes, that's part of the federal program. But if they don't come to school, we can't feed them. If their parents aren't at home, we can't feed them. If they don't have any money at home, we have to feed them. And so, but we only feed them Monday through Friday. So what about Saturday and Sunday?
Matt, how are you touched in any way by what happens from Washington, D.C. by this entity, which is actually the smallest cabinet office of all in the entire federal government, the U.S. Department of Education? How does that impact your life in Chicago at the charter school that you're a principal of?
Well, we are a charter school that does not raise any outside funds, and that's true for all 15 of the ACERO schools in Chicago, meaning that we have the same amount of money per student as the traditional public schools in the city. And that's in contrast to some charter schools that have foundations that work with them, that are able to raise additional income. And so when there is a change in federal funding, they're able to weather that storm. And so we have about 10% of our funding that comes from title money, Title I, Title II, and we count on that money being there because it pays the portion of a number of different salaries. And so without that money being there, other programs get money pulled out of them, and those programs suffer. I was speaking with the principal, and there was a reduction in the Title II funds last year, which is for teacher professional development. Well, they already had their professional development plan in place, and so as opposed to cutting teacher professional development or cutting instructional coaches, they shifted money from operations to cover that cost and then laid off 5 night custodians. And so in this case, the shift, like a fairly minor shift, $150,000 in their budget of Title II money, it didn't affect the programs that the federal government was intending the money to go towards, because the money was they already had guaranteed those programs, and so then 5 people, working class people, end up out of their jobs. And so this is the way that something happening at the federal level has an impact at a school that is very unintended.
If this was a debate, by the way, and I mentioned the Kentucky congressman who wanted to eliminate the Department of Education, I would have said, card number 36, Kentucky Republican Congressman Thomas Massey introduced a one-sentence bill, the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. Isn't that the way it works? Speed read, okay. So it was Thomas Massey, is the Kentucky Republican congressman who introduced that bill, by the way. I want to look at, again, back to these programs themselves, just to get a little bit fresh on the bones. I thought Michael did a great job of, at the very beginning, articulating, okay, what are these programs they actually do, and try to do it in a great way with not using education speak. But one of the things, so we're looking at the money that goes, $13 billion a year in federal aid sent to districts to aid the education of students with disabilities, and what he called Title I, which allocates $16 billion to serve disadvantaged students. Well, there never used to be a Department of Education up until 1979. What happened to that before then? Well, all of those programs were administered from the Department of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services. So what would stop all of those programs eliminating the Department of Education? What would be so wrong with just taking those programs and putting it over there?
At the Department of Health and Human
Yes.
Services as it stands today?
Yes.
I mean, I think if you ask HHS staff, their first answer is going to be there's a capacity issue.
Okay.
That they're not going to be able to take over $60+ billion of funding in a policy area that they're not familiar with. I mean, I think that's going to be the first pushback from HHS. And I want my next statement to be clear that I'm not advocating for the dissolution of the Department of Education, but I don't know that it would be a bad thing if we had a less siloing of the federal government so that we worked with HHS on education issues. So if that is the question, is it people who are focused on health and human services took over education in theory? I don't think that that is an all bad solution, but I think in terms of the way that the federal government is set up today, it is just not something that that agency could take on.
And Sändra, you mentioned, for instance, your biggest concern about what would happen with the Department of Education was the issue of civil rights.
Yeah.
That under the Department of Education has an office inside that department called the Office of Civil Rights. That's not too
Appropriately
complicated.
named.
Absolutely. That's not too complicated.
That does not have anybody working for it now underneath the, sorry.
And an important distinction is it's the Office for Civil Rights.
Thank you. So fact-checking there going on right now.
It's important, yeah.
And one of the things about that office, though, is, I mean, this is the same office, by the way, that also was looking at things like transgender bathrooms and allowing people to go to making sure that people who were transgender could go to any bathroom. But the suggestion from Congress is that the office wouldn't be eliminated, that it would just simply be moved to the Department of Justice's existing civil rights agency. That agency already enforces many of the same statutes as the one in the Department of Education. So would we really be eliminating anything, Sändra?
Yes, because you then have people who don't know anything about education distributing education material, and which is the problem in the first place. So you have to have, there's difference between civil rights and education and civil rights in the middle of the street. And there's difference in a public facility versus a private facility. And if I have a restaurant, there's civil rights, but I don't, the restaurant is not federally funded. The public school is.
Well, can I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
I don't even understand necessarily like what problem is trying to be solved by moving. So if you got 100 lawyers that are working for civil rights in the education department, and now you just move them to the Justice Department, like it's not clear to me that that saves a dime. It's not clear. So, and it even sort of embedded in your question that you had earlier, okay, let's move something to HHS, but if it's all the same number of programs doing the same things, I mean, it's like okay, so we shuttered the Department of Education, but if you're still spending all the same amount of money and doing the same sort of things, it's just shuffling around chairs.
And I do want to make one point, and I think this depends on perspective, but I consider education itself a civil right, and your equitable access to that opportunity as a civil right of all our students. And so in this specific instance, if you have a civil right of your own, it makes sense that there's an office there to protect it within that space with experts that know what that looks like and what that really means, versus people who think about civil rights more generally that may not have that level of expertise.
Okay. The debate question is, should the federal government increase funding to elementary and secondary education? Should there be more regulations? So I was trying to establish here that why do we have it to begin with, and could it be done in a different way? And on the question of money, and I see that Stephen STEIGMAN is there, but let me just, before we get to you, Stephen, and if you have a question, if you want to put your name on there, we'll come to you with your question. We would love to engage you in that. But the question of money, I mean, is money really a signal of higher student achievement? If you have more money, does that correlate, Matt Katz, to having better student test scores?
It doesn't hurt. More money means you can have a lot more flexibility in your programming. The things that I saw at the schools that I visited yesterday in Kansas City, the Kaufman School and the University Academy, the things they were able to do with their money were impressive and made me extremely jealous for our students, that I wish that we had the money to do things like that. And so I guess I know that money is not the silver bullet, but it makes almost as much difference as anything can.
And money provides opportunity, and that's what this is all about, is everyone should have the same opportunity to a great public education, which is not happening because of the money.
I've heard you, we spoke on the phone prior to doing this panel about your concerns about school funding, but what really, on a practical basis though, looking at your own school, what are you not doing at your school today that you say were even doing 12 months ago? Are there programs you've eliminated because funding has become such an issue?
As a matter of fact, because there's no money and there are not people coming to get jobs, I have some special needs students who are not being sent to my classroom because there's no paraeducator to take them. And then we don't have enough people to take them. So yes, there's no money. If there's no money, you can't hire people. And if you don't pay them enough, they're not going to come get the job. And so to sit there and work 8 hours a day with 3 people that are the size of middle linebackers for one student, because that's how violent that student is, and you can't get people to take that job, then that student doesn't get an education. And so that student needs the education just like everybody else does. It's a civil right. And so if we would pay the people who are doing these jobs a livable wage, then maybe they would come and do the job, because there are people that love working with kids and they will do that. But who wants to work for you can't live on $10 an hour and raise a family. And so yes, if they would fund and provide more money, then there would be more opportunity for more people to have jobs.
Okay, Michael McShane, before we go to Stephen STEIGMAN and your questions, just for a moment, have we established in our research world, in all of the things you've poured through, all those complicated, very large documents that mostly sit on shelves gathering dust, that there is a correlation, though, between the money spent and actually improving student achievement?
So, I mean, this has been one of the most hotly debated topics for probably the last 30 years at least. And, you know, I would say that the weight of the evidence for maybe like 25 of the last 30 years was that there wasn't necessarily a super strong correlation between the two. There has been some recent research, though, that I think has called that into question. So there's a really talented, a fellow Chicagoan, Carabo Jackson, who's at Northwestern, who did some really interesting studies on this. there are limitations to studying the effects. So from a researcher's perspective, so obviously with a teacher's perspective, they can tell you very concretely, this is how we spend money, and so this is how it matters. You know, it's challenging from a research perspective because you can, as a researcher, we can only look backwards, right? So we can say, oh, in 1985, going from X number of dollars to Y number of dollars had this effect on students. Well, the question is, would that same change be the same today, now that we're spending more money? So I think it's a complicated topic to try and parse, and I think if I'm a betting man, it will not be a settled question anytime in the near future.
Okay, you're listening. Yes, please, Lorén.
So if I could just disagree, but I think it depends on what question you're asking and which one you're answering. So if the question is, does more money mean better outcomes, just as a blanket question, then I don't know that I agree with you, but I can't flat out disagree. I think the better question is, when that money is spent in particular ways, does it lead to better outcomes? And the evidence on that is that we know there are interventions, there are different improvement techniques, improvement science, and can help turn around schools that do cost more money. And when that money is available, they are effective. And so I think it's just an issue that you can't say, does more money equal, does X equal Y? It's more nuanced than that, and we have to be cognizant of that when discussing it.
Excellent. All righty, we're now going to engage you in some of the questions. I, just like any debater, come prepared with lots of information, pithy questions, and I've got piles of them. I'm willing to rip them up to hear from you. Stephen STEIGMAN from KCUR News. Who's our first caller today?
I don't have a name with this one, but that's okay. The very first question I got was about a court case I was not familiar with which I was not familiar. Is that right? And because I wanted that KCPT water bottle, or maybe there was, I looked it up myself instead of letting one of these people tell me what it is. But here's the question, and I'll explain the case if you're not all familiar with it. If San Antonio versus Rodriguez were to be overturned, now this is the case that established local funding for public schools. If that were overturned, what form would a federal right to education take? Would it mean equity in funding for all students nationwide? Would it include preschool and college? The question here, and a few questions after that, were, suppose we were to reverse this formula, and instead of letting states decide on funding, let the federal government decide on funding. Would that be more equitable?
Okay, this is an excellent question. Matt Katz.
I did want to speak to this Supreme Court case because it's important also in something we've been talking about. This court decision established that education is not a civil right. The Supreme Court decided in this case that equal funding, that states do not have to fund the per pupil money for students equally because education is not a civil right. Now we've been up here saying that it is a civil right. We may think that it definitely is. This is a decision saying that it is not. And so if this case were to be reversed and it was required that students be funded somehow equally, even though we know that $10,000 in Chicago is not $10,000 in Omaha, but if there was a formula that was put in place to ensure equity of funding, then things like what Sändra is talking about and things like what happened to the school that I work at over the past 5 years, which is we lost our music teacher, we lost our kindergarten aide, and we lost our technology teacher, not as a result of federal funds being cut, but as a result of our per pupil money going down. If there was something in place to prevent that from happening, that would have made a big difference at both of our schools, because when funds went down in one bucket, there was nothing to replace them. If we were going to maintain equal funding, then when they went down in one bucket, something else would come in to replace them, and that is the problem for the people at the very smart people at the other end of the stage to figure out.
I want to ask, because I think who asked this question, by the way? Are you willing? You asked. Okay. Well, you don't get anything. Yeah. You're not a student, but excellent question. I think it's a fabulous question. But let's just think about: is the United States unusual, Michael, in that most of the funding for schools is actually coming from that local state level? Is that unusual, or is that how some other countries do it too? Or is it mostly a federal, national level funding in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because there's so many countries. And I don't know how, I know in the UK it's some combination that's over there. I know what Germany has a more federal system, Canada has a kind of decentralized system, I think Australia does too. But in most, like a lot of European countries and others, I think they tend to be more centralized. Don't fact check me on that one.
Fact checker.
Yeah, fact checker, I'm giving you plenty of stuff on this one. But
What would be the positive side to saying, let's have the federal government doing this?
well, I mean, so this is the sort of interesting thing. So it is true in the San Antonio case that there's not a federal right to an education, but it is true that in every state constitution you have a right to an education, or at least there's a right to a system of public schools. And to be honest, I mean, when I think of what would happen, if I'm answering honestly, what would happen if the Supreme Court turned that over? I mean, state courts have been litigating these for like at least 40 years. So I imagine many of the same similar arguments. So I mean, here in Kansas City, another court case that many of you could familiarize yourself with, Missouri versus Jenkins, this landmark desegregation case that lasted for, I think, north of 20 years, hinging on many of these same issues. So you have the state level constitutional provisions, and then on top of this, having some kind of federal constitutional provision. I mean, I think the practical aspect of it would be tied up in the courts for an incredibly long amount of time, because, and this is where like I may be the lone voice on the dais for this, like I oftentimes don't think that courts are necessarily the best venue to adjudicate some of these claims, adjudicate appropriately, because I tend to think that courts, especially when it comes to rights, can be very good at making kind of bright line judgments. This person is allowed to get married, right? This person is allowed to vote. But the court's not necessarily saying just because you have a right to be married that you're going to have a great marriage, or just because you have the right to vote, you're going to have good people to vote for. So those tend to be the things that we have to entrust to our legislatures and our elected representatives to decide. So how much money are we supposed to spend? What types of programs are supposed to happen? And like we had here in Kansas City, we essentially had a federal judge dictating things for 20 years, and it was a mess.
Lorén, what do you think of this, though? Would you have more faith in a system in which the federal government was allocating the funding for schools than the current system in which state and local governments are engaged in that practice?
Yeah, so I think the honest answer is I don't know, right? Like it's very hard to know if something would be better or more efficient or more effective if it's not been done before here. I can obviously make an argument that yes, it would be more equitable in the sense that we can make sure that students with similar challenges were being funded in the same way across the nation in a way that did not rely on because they live in a poorer neighborhood, they have less money. So in those aspects, yes, in theory, I think it would be better. In practice, I don't know. I mean, it could end up being so, coming so far from the top down that the money is not used in the way that it's intended. And so it would be a whole system of things to decide the answer to that specific question. But I do think that there's an argument to be made that it would be more equitable in the sense of making sure that students had it could be more equitable in making sure that students have the resources that they need and that those resources are not dictated by where they live, what their last name is, what they look like, the education of their parents, which we know is what currently drives.
So Sändra, would you have more faith in the Kansas legislature giving you I like a little expression.
You have to pick between those two, the Kansas legislature and the federal one.
Funding that, or would you have more faith in Washington providing you those dollars?
Oh, my. Having lived, that's not a fair question. You're asking me to believe in those people that are, no, I just wouldn't do it. I was thinking about when you're talking about fully fund, and I'm going to get this wrong, so fact finder tell me. It's PLL 72, remember the one where the federal government said?
94, 140.
Yeah, 91.
That's complicated.
Oh.
Which one's
Okay, so it's the law that says that the federal government will fully fund special education.
Okay.
Now, had they ever done that, we wouldn't, this is my opinion, we would not be in this predicament. Had they fully funded special education in 1972 when they said they were going to do it, and if they did it every year since then, we would have plenty of money. I don't know, because I have no crystal ball, but I've been in education for over 30 years, and I know that if all the money would have been there would have been more money that wouldn't have been spent on special ed that wasn't necessary, be pull out. So that's I just think that if they had ever fully funded it, so in answer to your question, do I trust them? No, because they haven't ever done what they said in the first place.
Okay, very good. Another question then, Stephen Steigman.
Oh, I've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
But we're not going to get through all of them tonight. But I'm going to ask one, and
I'll
then
move
I'm
them
gonna
along.
I'm going to have Donovan from Raytown ask another one. If the Department of Education, or parts of it, was sent to the Justice Department and Civil Rights, where would the saved money go?
You have to.
I think there wouldn't be any. I can't imagine, if it's sort of a one-for-one transfer of there's 100 lawyers here, goes 100 lawyers here, it's not clear to me how it would save a single penny.
Got it. And I'm going to have Donovan ask his question.
Donovan, we're thrilled that you're here. That's my middle name, by the way. I have a
That's
soft
right.
spot for that.
Yeah, so earlier the screen up there showed that the per pupil funding in both Kansas City and Missouri, or Kansas and Missouri, was just over $9,000. Can you explain and like put into perspective, what does each of those dollars do? What does it go to specifically? For instance, what's the difference between a $1 funding cut, a $100 funding cut, and a $1,000 funding cut? Like, how big of an impact does that really make?
Yes. Good question.
Great question.
Would you like to take a stab at that, Sändra, or not? I'm not going to put you on the spot. Who would like to have a go at
Simple
that?
math, I can do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can talk to.
Matt, please.
You go ahead.
The way that if you were to get $10,000 per student, and a student leaves your school and no one else comes to replace them, you have $10,000 fewer in your budget. That's $10,000 to pay for teachers, supplies, field trips, all of the things that you kind of, books, curriculum, the things that you take for granted happening at your school. And so if there is a 10% reduction in per pupil funds, that's not 10% of your total budget. It's closer to like 6% of your total budget, because there are other funds that are not tied up in the per pupil funding. But it just means that you're looking at all of your programming and you're saying, what is the 6%? How much of this money, how many staff positions do I have to cut? How many field trips do I have to cut? How many programs do I have to cut in order to make up for this reduction that has come either because of instability at the state or changes in federal funding? Did I answer that question?
Okay. Not every student, though, is worth the same amount of money.
Right.
Lorén, so you have, and it's true in Kansas and other states, that so you'll see a low, what they call base aid per pupil. You think, oh, they only get that much. But if you have a special needs, or you have a disability, is English language learning also an additional pot of money that each child who is an English language learner, they'll get more money?
Yeah, so it depends on the funding formula, of course, at the state that you're talking about in the district. So you have states like California that have a local control funding formula where certain groups of students, English learners included, get more in the formula than a student who was not an English learner, assuming that that student doesn't also fall into one of the other categories. So it's going to be different everywhere, but it definitely, funding formulas often take into account the additional services that a student may need because they are a student with a disability, because they are a student who's learning English, because they're a foster student, a homeless student, a number of other designations that can often bring additional funds with it.
Now, one of the legitimate concerns that are happening right now with regards to though I talked about the potential elimination of the Department of Education, which would require Congress acting, which would be a very difficult thing at this point to do. However, the president's budget does involve a 13% cut in the Department of Education budget. It's likely you can see cuts in that budget. The things we're talking about then is cutting some of those additional funds that go to those students. So if there's less money for children with disabilities or special needs or English language learners, what does that do for a school like yours, Sändra?
They'll pull the money out of somewhere else and something else will fall to the wayside if there's money there. So it's really hard to tell. I just know, directly today, the kid couldn't come to class because there was no one hired to work for them. And so if they cut it, then they'll move money, just like you said earlier, someone said earlier, where they moved money to fix the operations. Well, there's only so much money you can have to move. And when you run out of that pot, when that pot is empty, where are you going to move it?
Yes. And just before we move to the next question, you are in a charter school, Matt. Do you get the same amount of money when we talk about, say, if you were in the equivalent of a Kansas or Missouri, as we're in here, would you get the same as the traditional public school, or do you get a lesser amount per student?
In Chicago, it's very close. You get probably 2% less per student because the funding formula at the state level, there's a slight variation in it. And so there are always advocacy groups advocating for charters to say, really, if we're saying we're doing it with the same amount of money, it should be the same amount of money.
So what was the argument given then for not giving you exactly the same? Why say 2% less?
What's interesting and what ties back to another thing we've been talking about is the funding formulas are extremely complex. And so even within Title I is broken down into like 4 different pieces. And you can be a district that's really good at writing the grants to fit right into these pieces, or you can be a district that is not as good, and that determines the amount of money you're getting per student. And so having certain efficacy at the district level, which obviously has nothing to do with principals or teachers, can be the difference in how that formula is utilized. And in answer to your question about what is the argument given for why it is not equitable, that is something that's above my pay grade.
And you know, it would be really nice if grants were used the way that they were initially set up, which was to enhance education. And right now, the grants that we write and we get are used to fund education, many of them. And so if we were fully funded, then those grants would enhance rather than.
Ready for another question,
Oh, yeah,
Stephen?
I got lots of them. Here's one about going back to state versus federal funding of schools. This one from Ian Hammer, right up there. Ian, raise your hand. If the U.S. decided to substantially increase funding for education, would states still fund schools? If so, would that benefit students with a better education? And along the same lines, if we set a fixed fund for all the schools in America, how do you believe this will affect schools in cities such as Chicago, with a higher cost of living, of course, as opposed to, and different populations in many ways, as opposed to a city like Omaha, Nebraska?
I think students in New York City should get exactly the same amount of money as those in Colby, Kansas, Steve. But that's my viewpoint.
It is close to Manhattan,
Okay,
right?
absolutely. Mike McShane.
No, I mean, like, I think this actually cuts to the core of a couple things. One is that, I don't envy you all when I looked at the debate topic. Because to me, when I look at it, it sort of has like 2 pieces to it when it talks about sort of enhancing money or regulation and the federal government doing it. Because I could imagine, there's a way to make an argument to say, well, we think that schools should get more money, but it shouldn't necessarily come from the feds. So it's sort of answering yes to half of the question and not to the other. And I think you get to the core of if we were to try and do this at the federal level. I mean, Matt was exactly right. If you look at any state funding formula, so the organization I work for put out just an explainer of Missouri's, and I think it stretches like 30 or 40 pages just to describe how much money is supposed to follow each child into each classroom. I imagine if we tried to do that at the federal level and try to equalize cost of living differences and regional labor markets and all of that stuff, it would have to be a formula a country mile long. So I think that's why some of these things, like, in theory saying, okay, like maybe if the federal government played a larger role in this, but I think the actual practicality of trying to design a funding formula that worked for all 54 million school children stretching everywhere from Alaska to Miami and all parts in between, I think would be incredibly challenging to try and craft.
Lorén.
Oh, I was just going to say that your question, I think, raises an important distinguishment that we need to make between equal funding and equitable funding and what that means and what that looks like. I think an equal funding formula is easy, right? You have in theory, you have a pot of money, you divide it by the number of kids in the United States, and you send it out to their schools. An equitable funding formula is going to be much more complicated in the way that he just discussed, in adjusting for cost of living, adjusting for the specific needs of students, and what that really looks like in practice, I think, is what's hard for us to wrap our head around.
For sure.
You get a reverse version of that for an excellent explanation. Anybody else on that question before we move on? We're moving on. Yes, Stephen.
Oh, you're going to me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I thought you were the one with the question. Well, I do have before I go to the next question, Diana, you had a question here. Just raise your hand so I can have you ask it. Oh, right there. Okay. In fact, why don't I just have you ask a question right now?
So my question was, are the schools thinking about, well, the federal government in another case, thinking about the way to spend and fund the money for schools, but guided by the way the students learn? It is very, very just extended, and we're not all the same. So we're probably just wasting our money thinking that everybody learns the same, and that $10,000 for each student will probably work the same in each one. Probably one student only needs $2,000 because they just learn a different way. And another student needs $20,000 because they just don't learn the same, you know? They have they're different. So are you guys thinking about that? Is anybody thinking about that?
Okay. Now, just thinking about that question, I thank you so much, Diana, for asking the question. But really, when we think about that at a federal level, but really at the state level, nothing is done with regards to thinking about it, that it takes a student, one type of student, longer to learn something, or they may take an additional amount of money. There's no consideration given for that.
Well, there is, and that's where the Title I monies come from.
But only if you fit into a certain category. It's not really about your learning capacity. If you are low income, English language learner, have a disability, but not based on your capacity to, you might need additional help beyond that.
Right, and as a budget, then that's where that money gets funneled to. So if I have a student that needs mental health services, that needs nursing services, and who's still not categorized, I still have to pay for the nurse, I have to pay for the social worker, I have to pay for the counselor, I have to pay for the psychologist. That's not taken out, that could be taken out of that. I have a kid who's high on the spectrum on autism. It takes $22,000 to $25,000 to educate that child. It may take another $2,000, and so that's a great question. But I think that as that money is gone, it's not given to each student. It's here's the money, and here you all have to spend it. It's kind of like how you get your allowance. Am I going to pay for my phone bill? Or am I going to pay for gas in my car?
Yeah,
That
I
would
would,
be.
oh, go
Go ahead. No, that's.
I would add to what she's saying that it is the school's job, the teacher and the principal's job to know that their students are going to learn in different ways. And as a student, if you're not learning in the way your teacher is teaching, tell them that and say, this isn't working for me. Every day I sit here and I don't understand it. And I think that that is the same, you've identified the same truth as a one-size-fits-all program. If the federal government were to say, everyone needs to do this computer program because this is the computer program that's going to catch everyone up in math, that would be a grave error because it's really working in Boston public schools, and so we want to put it everywhere. What's working in one place for one child, for one school, one district is not going to work elsewhere, and to try to control from the top down in that way, it often leads to unintended consequences.
If I could I know part of the question was, are we thinking about this at the federal level? And by no means am I speaking for the federal government, but I do have these conversations at the federal level. I think everyone in education policy is cognizant that that is something that's important to learning, but in thinking about what role the federal government can play, that is not something that that the federal government is going to put in practice, right? We have very intense debates about when the federal government is being too prescriptive, and by too prescriptive, we mean No Child Left Behind, that did not tell you exactly how to teach which student in what way. And so if that is too prescriptive, then the option that the federal government would dictate learning styles or practices within the classroom is not on the table at all.
Well, and I think this gets to the core of your debate topic in general, and sort of thinking about this role of the federal government, that as policymakers get farther away from the actual act of teaching, like what is going on in your classroom between you and your teacher, between you and your classmates, it gets more and more abstract. right? So your teacher might know you very, very well and might know, oh, you need some extra time on this, or all the sort of variations that exist there. Even taking that to the district level, it's very difficult. Like your superintendent probably doesn't know that about you, right? Then we take it another level of abstraction and we talk at the state level, and then we take it another level of abstraction and talk about it at the federal level. So at each one of those levels, the data that we collect, the actual knowledge that we have about students gets less and less, and the tools that we have to do anything sort of get blunter and blunter. And so I think it's something to sort of think about in any sort of policy matter that you're talking about. As you get more removed from the actual act of teaching and learning, you're going to get into these levels of abstractions.
So why would we ever think then, if the federal government was engaged in this, taking the state and local governments out of funding schools, and let's have the federal government do this, that somehow they're going to have a better handle on what's happening to students than those in their own communities?
Well, I think it's still to the point of what he just said. If we're being honest, it's not the state and local government that make that decision either, right? It's the people who are in the classroom. So it's not happening at the district level or the state level. So using this idea that the further you get away, there's more abstraction, doesn't justify that the federal government has no role at all or couldn't be better at providing resources generally. It's just a recognition that there is the classroom decisions that are made, with the idea that if you were fully funded, you could make those personal decisions for each and every one of your students to make sure that they were learning in the right way. And or at least what I've been talking about is where that money comes from. But I don't think that the local or the state is any better prepared to make those choices about what's happening in the classroom. The teachers are and the administrators.
But they try.
Stephen.
I've received a lot of questions here about where would funding come from? Here, in your opinion, this is from Jacob. In your opinion, where should we start gaining more funds for federal education, for federally funded education? Should the money be taken out of other federal departments? And in the words of another person, why is the government wasting money on places and companies when there are actual places, people, and things that need the money? I know I'm opening up a huge can of worms right
Okay,
there.
well, so at the local and state level, schools they're being funded by the property tax. What would the federal government do to fund schools, and what would be the method by which they would collect funds to support this amazing new equitable and equal school funding system?
So I think this is one of the challenges that we talk about in practice. I don't know exactly what it would look like, right? I mean, you can talk about an idea where you would still funnel those property taxes up in a way that the federal government would collect them and then disperse them. You could talk about taking money from other large programs that I do not find to be as deserving as education. So there would be a variety of ways to do it. I think that's in the details that we just don't know until it's a program that we see. But I think the umbrella answer is the funding's going to come from taxes. So that's either going to be a funneling of taxes that are already there that have traditionally gone to local and state governments. It's going to be an increase of taxes in some way across the country, or it's going to be a shifting of taxes that are already collected to come into the Department of Education.
Two suggestions. I don't know if you saw the story. You know, the president has donated his entire salary as president. You know that. And he's been donating it. He's not been accepting a dime. And each quarter he gives his salary to a different department of government. And in fact, the last quarter he gave, because he makes $400,000 a year, $100,000 of his salary to the U.S. Department of Education. So there's $100,000. We're getting somewhere close. And what about, because another area of great concern for Donald Trump, because he doesn't like him very much, is Amazon. So we would look at a national internet tax, retail tax, that could also be used to support education. That would be another big pot of money that could help support schools.
Lottery.
Here's a question from Alexander Fortune. Alexander, where are you? You know what? Can I have you read this one? And while I'm walking up there, I'm going to have you ask another one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Or I can walk really quickly, which I'm not doing right now. I'll walk quickly.
Look at this.
I don't get paid to jog.
And he was ready to go without the mic.
All states don't charge that tax.
Okay. So there's not that much Title I funds. There's like $14 billion or so. That was in 2013. I don't know. And like the average student gets about like $500 to $600 from Title I funds. And like in 2013, there was about like $10,000 for like every fund for each student. So I'm like asking, since we have a president that doesn't really push on strong education, what alternatives can we do with the Title I money we have? Like what other programs can we have like that would be in place instead of Title I?
Okay, all right, this is an excellent question. So I just looked this up, by the way. So we're looking at roughly $15 billion going to Title I. This is the program for schools with high concentrations of poor children. The president wants to actually add $1 billion for Title I funding. It's $15 billion. He wants to add $1 billion. The new funds would be used, quote, to encourage districts to adopt a program allowing local, state, and federal funds to follow children to whichever public school they choose. That's what the plan is when it comes to Title I funds. So now you can take disadvantaged children and permit them to go to any school that they want with those dollars. Now, Matt Katz is a charter school principal, but we have others around the table. I mean, what would be the positive and what would be the downside of that?
Well, just as a procedural issue, I think the bills that have gone through the Senate and the House right now in the actual budget did not approve that provision.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen this year, more than likely. I don't know if you want to.
No, that's right. No, I was going to say, that was the way I remembered it, and we have a fact checker here, which is great, was that, yeah, the initial Trump budget was basically not touching Title I and IDEA and slashing a whole lot of everything else. But was it in the last week or so in committee, a bunch of that stuff got added back in. So I think that like the net effect.
It's going to be an increase.
An increase.
Yeah, so I'm not, because there's a fact checker here and that's intimidating, I'm probably not going to give you a number. I think it's just over 20 million right now that's moving through the House that would be an increase for the Department of Education. So the proposed initial cuts were, the big ones were for Title II, which is money that's going for teachers, part of Title II, and for 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which you can think of as after-school programs. That was about $1 billion. So they had really looked at large programs where they could make really big cuts. Both of those programs are funded, in addition to other programs that got increases kind of throughout the budget. So if you look at the process itself, I know this is not getting to your question, the House and the Senate did not agree with the president. We probably are going to end up with a slight increase for funding.
Well, this is, and to answer your question, here's the dirty little secret when it comes to politics talking about eliminating the Department of Education. It makes like a good bumper sticker, but it ain't never gonna happen. Not gonna happen. If you even think about it, so it was established, as we said earlier, in 1979. Ronald Reagan runs in 1980, right? Just 1 year later on abolishing the Department of Education. More so later in his term, wildly popular president, didn't do it, right? Even a lot of these things that are happening now. All of these folks went to Washington saying, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education and others, and it's going to turn out that there's actually more money in it. Because what happens, I think, is that when people get to Washington or get to other places and say, well, wait a second, when I said I was getting here to get rid of the Department of Education, I didn't realize that the two biggest things I was going to cut is money that goes to low-income students and students with special needs, and just the politics around that is terrible. So I think that, I don't think Title I is going anywhere. Even Donald Trump said he didn't want to cut it, and a Republican-controlled House said they don't want to cut it either. So I think that's, it's here to stay.
But I think the other options, if that's what, so I would say that there are other possibilities of what you could do with kind of what they proposed, which was basically a voucher program. The political feasibility of that is probably low. What it's been called in the past is portability, and it's not been popular with kind of either side of the political parties. That's one option. I think really what I would argue the better question is how can we better use those Title I funds in terms of the, like, tracking where they actually go, knowing what they're being used for, because to me, that's where the breakdown is, not necessarily in what they're used for, but how they're used. So that doesn't really answer your question, but.
And just to add on, as a principal, I always count on the fact that that will never happen. That the thought of the federal government taking over all of the funding is a really terrifying one, and one that it seems like from a logistical standpoint, or shifting like the cost that they would incur and the complications that they would take on to try and fund every single student in America seems really unrealistic. Their ability to regulate the money that they give now, the 10%, is in itself very questionable. And so even if there were to be new regulations, people in my position would need to be audited before we would believe that they were actually going to be enforced.
Well, and I think one other thing if the portability of that money, that started about 2 years ago, and that's when we passed the ESSA, that was pulled out. Because if you can think of the accounting nightmare, I'm in Lawrence, and I'm a special needs kid, and I take my $9,255, oh, my parents are moving to Olathe. So how many days was I in school in Lawrence? We subtract that, and then Lawrence has to take that money and follow me to Olathe. Oh, my father got put in jail, going with my grandmother in Salina. So that's exactly what they want to do with that money. And in the meantime, where's the kid? And that's one of those things that's just not realistic.
Stephen.
John Patterson from Lincoln Prep. Can you raise your hand? Okay, we're gonna tag team on this question here. There are two questions here. And I'm gonna take the one from Brianna Maldonado here, who asks, how are American students supposed to receive adequate education and compete in a global society if funding is not increased or if funding is cut? And John, I'm gonna have you ask the next one, which kind of goes along the same lines.
Okay. I said, how does fine arts fall into the debate of state, federal, and local funding? Would you consider non-core classes such as Spanish, music, theater to be less important to the growth of students into adulthood?
What about those fine arts, music, things we tend to think of as electives and not necessities?
I would say, just jumping in, but others can probably do better than I am. I mean, so there's the funding question and there's also the regulation question, right? So when we talk about things like No Child Left Behind and other sort of accountability mechanisms, No Child Left Behind was driven by measuring math and reading test scores, right? And so a lot of those other classes that we think are incredibly important for students, everything from physical education to theater and others, become something that's not tested anymore. And there was this theory at the time that was, well, look, like if you're good at this, you'll be good at everything else. And I think that there's a substantial amount of data out there that will tell us that there was some narrowing that took place. People began to focus more and more on promoting math and reading. So that's sort of the regulation part of your question. Y'all can probably answer the funding bit better. But that's, as we think about the types of metrics that would be used to regulate schools, you have to think, I think it was Bill Clinton who said what gets measured is what matters. So if we're counting on math and reading test scores, people are going to focus on trying to juice math and reading test scores. And it could come at the expense of other aspects of learning that we care about kids.
About 18 months ago on KCPT, we had 4 superintendents, 2 from the Kansas side, 2 from Missouri, and we prodded and poked them on a variety of issues in education. One of them was that very question. There were concerns at that time that they were cutting back on funding, and every single one of those superintendents said no, they had not cut any arts programming. In fact, they'd only increased it. One of those superintendents was the superintendent of the Lorén School District. Have you cut arts programs?
Not that I can tell.
Okay. How about, I mean, does that feel the squeeze over at your charter school in Chicago, Matt Katz?
Sure. Chicago Public Schools measures school success on student attendance, math scores, and reading scores. Our charter network, which I think of as progressive, also measures essentially along those lines with a few other metrics. But there is no measure for science. There's certainly no measure for arts. There is an arts certification that the district gives if you have a certain number of minutes per child in the arts. But what the regulation does is it makes, as a school leader, you have to prioritize, if your school is struggling to survive, you're going to prioritize your reading and math scores so you can get off the bottom of whatever rating system you're on and try and get yourself up to the next level. Once you're there, then you can start to look around and say, okay, I know that there are kids who are never going to love math and reading, and they're never going to be super talented at it, but they are super talented at arts, they are super talented physically. What programs can I get in place so that they can be happy at school and still thrive in school? But when every incentive is pushing you towards reading and math scores, there's going to be a certain number of school leaders who say to them, then that's what's important, and that's what I'm going to do. Okay. That's what
And Michael, I mean, the first part of the question was, I mean, how is the United States going to compete against other countries if funding is cut? But is the United States spending more, less, or about the same as other Western democracies?
It's actually one of the highest spending nations that we have. I think Luxembourg and maybe somebody else beats us. But on a per pupil level, we spend more than most other countries do.
And we spend on par with the most successful education countries in the world, like Finland and South Korea. It's about the same per student, so they're doing somewhere baked into their system is something that's helping them be more successful.
I'm going to take another question in a moment from Stephen, but let me ask you this. This is a bigger picture to make sure we're getting some other concerns that you may have, and this is a multiple choice question. The biggest challenge facing education in my school, if you're in one, is A, classroom size, B, poverty, C, bullying, D, student attitudes and behaviors, E, parental involvement, F, funding, or G, something completely different. Sandra?
Could you repeat the?
No, I'm not repeating them.
Okay. I didn't write all the answers down. All of the above. You didn't give me that option.
Okay, you think all of the above. All right.
It's pretty much all of the above.
Matt?
Well, we have 32 students per class in all 15 of our schools. I think that makes for a challenging situation for a teacher in which you might have 31 students who are on board and one student that still needs a lot of support. And a 1 to 32 ratio is one where it's hard to give one student the support they may need when you have 31 others who are also clamoring for your support.
You know, we framed this as about funding and regulation because of the debate topic, but when you really look at the challenge of education, the biggest challenge for you, Lorén, is what?
Yeah, so I think at the policy level, admitting that I'm not in the classroom, the biggest challenge for us is poverty, just because poverty is then linked to so many of the other, is linked in such a strong way to a lot of the outcomes that we see. Excuse me, so trying to figure out poverty policy, or anti-poverty policy really, we think would have a significant impact on education policy. But that is from the, 10,000-foot view.
Michael?
You know, I don't know what my answer would have been other than an experience I actually had this morning. So because I wanted to be here with y'all today, I had to give a talk in Lake Tahoe, California yesterday. So I actually woke up, I was picked up at 3:30 this morning and driven from Lake Tahoe into Reno, Nevada to catch a flight to come here. And so it was like an hour-long cab ride that I took. And the young woman who gave me a lift was probably in her early 20s. And because I'm an education dork, and when you have to make time on like an hour-long trip, I ask people, so where'd you go to school, and how did you like school? And she had this fascinating story. She had attended multiple schools, actually split time between the United States and Mexico. And so I said, in all of these schools that you have, like, what was the similarity and difference? What was the difference between going to school in Mexico versus going to school in America and the different schools that you went to? And you know what she said the one thing they all had in common was? Bullying.
Bullying?
She said bullying. Every school that she's gone to, she saw this sort of plague of bullying everywhere. So I maybe would have had some more detached, research-based answer if I hadn't had that experience this morning. But I think that that's something, again, I don't know what the federal government can do about it or others, but I think that that's something that is incredibly challenging that we need to be dealing with.
Think about your own schools, ladies and gentlemen. Who would put bullying as one of the #1 issues in your school?
You're in high school.
Okay, but there's a few of you. Okay, so we do have that as a challenge. Give us a final amazing question,
Oh my gosh.
Stephen, that is
Don't put
so
that pressure on me,
amazing
Nick.
that there will be standing ovations.
I had a
uproarious
dozen great
applause.
questions.
Okay,
And
all
so
right.
many of them are not going to get answered
Okay,
tonight. But I want to
sure.
go back to, can I get 2 questions?
Let's try it.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask you in just a moment to take out your crystal balls. But for now, I want to go back to something Lorén just brought up, which was poverty. And here to ask a question, Moriana, right? I'm going to have Moriana ask this question.
I asked, how are families with poverty supposed to be successful in school and in life if they don't even have the funding they need and the education they need?
The question there being, and tell me if I'm wrong, is we're talking about this at a very macro level, but if we're not, what things can the federal government, can state governments do to support families in their pursuit of education?
Well, Lorén, that's what you really do for a living, and that's what you actually do with members of Congress.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that was kind of the purpose of Title I, right? Is to overcome the challenges that students may face because of the additional challenges of living in poverty. So I think overcoming resource equity is the way that we address it at a policy level. At a practical level, I think, and I'm sure those of you in the classroom can talk about this more in depth, it looks a lot more about talking about the intersections of the different parts of our lives, right? So not only making sure that those students have enough funding in school, but making sure that they have adequate health care so that they come to school healthy and ready to learn, access to food so that they are fed when they come, and access to adequate housing so that they can rest at night, making sure that their parents have a livable wage so that they're not having to pitch in ways that children, quite frankly, should not have to. So that is what we're trying to do at the federal level by supplementing with more funds. I think we can all probably agree that we have not done that as a country and as a federal government adequately yet. But that is the purpose and the goal, because I think we all agree it's impossible to do without that extra help.
Okay. What was your second question there, Steve?
This is kind of my final wrap-up question.
Okay, we're ready for it.
Which is time to take out the crystal ball and make some predictions here. This question comes from Taylor Drummer, who asks, what do you think, or what will happen to the funding towards schools in the next 10 to 15 years? Will it change dramatically, or will it be about the same?
Okay, let's start with Matt Katz.
If I look at my crystal ball, and I think 10 years from now, where will we be with our funding? I would predict, based on the last 10 years, that funding will continue to move in the same trajectory that it has, as we will continue to trade political parties in the White House and Congress, and no one will really have the courage, and perhaps it is in good sense, to make a really major move, and so federal funding will continue in the trajectory that it's currently on.
I'm going to look into my crystal ball and be hopeful. And I really do see in the next 10 years, because of this, if you go vote and you start changing who is in your legislature, that will lead to who goes to Washington. And I truly believe that in 10 years, if everyone does their part, that it will be better, and it will get better, because you and all of your people that are the same age as you all over the country are going to finally start realizing how important and how powerful you are. And so my crystal ball shows that it's going to be, I won't be teaching then, trust me, that
you'll be the superintendent then.
No, I'm going to be the volunteer little old lady walking through the school making you guys go to class. I really think that it will get better, because we're no longer going to put up with the crap that's been going on. I think we've reached ahead, and I really do see that over the next 10 years, it's going to start getting better.
Now, my crystal ball smashed on the way in the UMKC parking lot on the way in. However, I saw Lauren Trull have a huge crystal ball in her suitcase as she came in here from Washington, D.C. today. What was in your crystal ball when it came to funding?
Yeah, so I think if you look at kind of what we've been talking about, the environment, looking that we have a Republican-controlled White House and also in Congress, and still the funding levels are kind of moving at what we've seen in the past, there's no indication to me that it is going to take an extreme dip or an extreme increase. My crystal ball, unfortunately, does not show that. What I do think that we should start looking for, and really looking for it at the local level, as we all know, despite the fact that I work at the federal level, most successful education reform movements has started at the local level. So if you're looking at local and state formulas become more detailed about how they're giving money and how they're spending money, how they're transparent about that, and being accountable for those dollars, I do think that we'll see a movement where there might not be a great increase, but we might have better information on how that money is used so that we can then spend it in a better way. So hopefully, even if it's not a lot more, it is going to be spent more effectively.
Okay, and Michael McShane, as you go from your office on Troost Avenue and go off to Mar-a-Lago and Trump Tower and the mansions of the governor's mansions in Topeka and Jefferson City, how do you see that trajectory going?
Yeah, I think I generally sort of agree with that. There'll be a lot of bluster and stuff about cutting things, but when the rubber actually hits the road, I think we'll continue to see. I think the real interesting question, like if you're interested in the sort of data and longer term trends of this, was that there was a pretty solid, I mean from the 1960s, as far back as we have data, a pretty solid increase trajectory, and the Great Recession is really what leveled it out. And the question from my mind is the Great Recession, the post-Great Recession era a new normal, where we're seeing a leveling off or much smaller increases, or are we going to go back to the types of increases that we saw prior to the Great Recession?
If this was a quiz show, this would be the end that we'd be hearing, ladies and gentlemen. You've been listening to Michael McShane, Lorén Trull, Sändra Walker, and Matt Katz. And of course, your amazing questions. Thanks also, by the way, to Stephen STEIGMAN of KCPT News for making sense of it all and engaging us in a great conversation. Alan Katz.
Yes, I come to put this first of all.